Wine Lewis. I was born in Omaha, August 10th, 1925. I have lived here, with the exception of a few years, all my life so far. I was very fortunate to have grandparents as I grew up. That probably is the reason why I have an ear for and an appreciation of Yiddish, because Yiddish was spoken in my grandparents' homes, and my brother and I were frequent visitors in our grandparents' homes. We had the distinction of being the first grandchildren, so we were pretty special. My grandparents had been here for some time. All of them came originally from various places in Russia. My father's parents came, my grandfather came earlier than my grandmother, which was the custom. She followed a few years after Zeta came. She followed with my dad, I think in 1904. Interestingly, and I didn't know this until fairly recently, my great-grandparents were here on my father's side before my grandparents, and in fact are buried at Golden Hill Cemetery. I didn't know them. They were gone before my time, but they were here. My mother's family, my grandfather and my mother, and I don't remember how many of her siblings came on what she always described as the very last ship before the start of World War I, the last ship to get across safely, which puts it, about 1914, I guess. Mother was a little older. As a result, didn't come here as a little bitty guy like my dad did. However, I was always proud of the fact that they were very American. Neither spoke with an accent, which for some reason was important when I was a little girl. We lived in not a Jewish neighborhood, as a matter of fact. We lived around 30th and Webster, California, in a neighborhood that really doesn't exist anymore. All of my friends were children that went to St. John's and whatever other parochial school was close by. As a result, I did not know Jewish children, didn't have Jewish children as friends until I got to high school. But we had a good Yiddish flavor in our home. Mother kept a traditionally kosher kitchen, as my grandmothers did, and came holiday time, we did the traditional things. Our seders, I remember as though it were yesterday. They were very traditional. They seemed to go on forever, but they were real seders. They had a beginning and a middle and an end, and you didn't get up and leave the table until my grandfather said, okay, that's the end. The high holiday time, I remember walking with my mother. My dad would go early to the synagogue, which was the Litvische Shul, it was called fondly. Beth HaMedrash HaGodel, I think, was its formal name. Dad would go early, as did my grandfather, and I think probably schlepped along a fairly unwilling brother of mine to go with the grown men folks. Mother and I would follow a little later. We walked. We certainly didn't drive, not in those days. And we did the traditional things. Every holiday was marked properly. My brother did not go to Talmud Torah, and I'm not sure how much Talmud Torah was in existence at that time for him. He had a tutor, I guess is its proper term, a nice Jewish man, Mr. Rotkovitz, who would come to our house a couple of times a week and give him private lessons. My brother had developed a strange, poor memory. He never seemed to remember to come home from school directly on those days, but they'd go get him, and he had to come for his lessons anyway. In the days of his bar mitzvah, which are many years ago, we didn't have the big to-do that we had when my boys were bar mitzvahed or when children are today. He said his mafter, he learned it and he said it. He learned a speech. And I believe on the Saturday of his bar mitzvah, my mother sent strudel and cake and, of course, the obligatory Bronfen, otherwise known as whiskey, and wine. And the tradition was observed on a much more modest scale than today. What else? My mother was at home, as mothers were in those years. She was fortunate. She didn't have to worry about bringing in any outside income. She was at home. She kept house. She cooked. And she baked. My mother had a wonderful reputation as a marvelous baker, and she earned that reputation. She really was. She was a mom that was at home when we kids came home from school. It was just the thing to do. As we got older, when my brother left, I think for the service, when I was away at University of Iowa, Mother became very involved in all sorts of volunteer work outside the house. Early on, those volunteer things had to do with the war effort, and when that was finished, she branched out and she became involved in what we would now, I suppose, call social services on an informal scale. Paul Bert, who at that time was the heart and soul of the Jewish community, I think, in many ways. Paul knew when somebody needed help. Paul knew when there was a Jewish person in a hospital who refused to eat non-kosher food, and he knew he only had to call Mary Wine, and kosher meals would be delivered. She got involved with our share home, with the building of it from the very beginning, and developed a great interest and a great love for her work with the residents of the share home. She became very well known with those people. She would not only come and do various arts and crafts and busy things with them, but she always brought treats and goodies, and the rules and regulations weren't quite so stringent in those days. You could bring in, a Mary Wine could bring in a great big cake and say, "This came out of my kosher kitchen," and she was believed, as she should have been, and it was accepted. And she would make a big urn of coffee about 3 o'clock, and everybody had a good time. And pretty soon, Thursday became Mary Wine Day. She did many, many things. She worked tirelessly for many Jewish causes in the community. She did help build the share home. She did, in fact, work just as tirelessly in the building of Beth Israel Synagogue. My mother, in fact, has had the dubious honor of being the first president, no, let me say that better, the president of the first sisterhood of Beth Israel. she and some, I don't remember who else, got their heads together and decided they needed a sisterhood. My mother also was very active in an organization called, we called it loosely and easily Bigger Cholim. I think people who know their Hebrew properly call it Bikur Cholim, and it still is an organization that exists today, more so in bigger cities, I think, than here, and it is an aid to the sick and the helpless, anyone who needs help or who is in trouble could count on one of the ladies, like my mother, Sophie Neveloff, who is a well-known name in this community. In fact, Sophie Neveloff was probably responsible for pulling my mother out of her kitchen in the comfort of her own living room and getting her involved in many of the things she did. Mother had, again, the very dubious honor of holding the presidency of that organization for, I think it was 35 years. I know I'm not exaggerating, it was at least 35 years. But she loved it. And she held it that long because after so many years, well, nobody else would take it, nobody else would do the work, and she and Sylvia Ross together held that organization in the palms of their hands for many years. That was the kind of role model my mother was. I've thought of her a lot recently. Always think of her a lot at holiday time, as I do of my dad. But if Mother had a neighbor who was ill, she didn't call and say, "Do you need something to eat?" She would cook a meal and send it across the street, or next door, or wherever the person was. There was a Yiddish expression which translated out to be, "You don't ask a sick person, you do for them." And that was kind of her motto, I think. She didn't ask, she did. She did that with her own family, with her own father and stepmother. My mother adored her father. I suppose like most daughters do, but my mother, to the end of her life, spoke respectfully and affectionately and admiringly about my Zeta. Papa would say, I can still hear her, Papa would say, and she'd quote, Mother had not a happy childhood, but she certainly pulled up her socks and made herself a wonderful adulthood and made herself known all over the Jewish community, as did my father. His interests were a little different. He was a businessman. He became more involved with the synagogue as he came closer to retirement years. He was a businessman. He worked on Saturday because that's what you did. You went and opened the business. My dad was in the car business all his life. Loved it, I might add, from the early days to the last days. Nobody, unless it was his daughter, ever got a bigger charge out of a flashy car or a fun car than Jake Wine. He dearly loved an open convertible when he was way past an age where you would have thought he might. Dad became closely associated with his synagogue, as I said, as he got a little older and as his hours were a little more relaxed when he had the luxury of time, and began to take more of an interest than he'd ever taken. He became involved in saving a little shul that was in its second or third incarnation, I think, by the time it was moved to 30th and Cumming Street, a little synagogue that had started its career somewhere on the near north side. And as the years went on, there were fewer and fewer people to come and make a minyan, but the Jewish men who went to that little synagogue felt a deep obligation to keep it open, to keep it alive, and my grandfather was one of those people early on that was involved in trying to save that shul. My dad, after my dad became involved in the same project. My dad and a dear, lovely man named Bill Gradinsky, whose father before him, I believe, was Rabbi Gradinsky. They were very devoted to the cause of keeping this little shul going. It is still, in a sense, alive in some ways because parts of the insides of it and parts of the shell have been put back together, so to speak, and are a part of the museum, which is added on to the south side of the Jewish Community Center. And it's a great nostalgia trip for many, many people to visit that little chapel. The Aaron Kodesh is there, some of the pews are there. I heard with my own ears a man in this community walk in and say, "I was bar mitzvahed right there." And he kind of choked a little as he said it. It was a trip back for him. Anyway, that was a little shul. My dad was pleased to be a part of that, I think. The other side of the coin of Jake Wine was his abiding, deep interest in the Masonic order, and he loved every minute of the 40 years he was involved with the Masons, the Shriners. He achieved a great status with it. I don't remember all the numbers and the who's and whatever, but he did finish as, I believe, a 33rd degree Mason, which is pretty high up in the order, and was respected and admired, and had many, many friends among the non-Jewish people with whom he associated in the Masonic order. They were his good buddies.
Take us back to your high school days, Bert.
Oh, I skipped Central High altogether, didn't I? Well, it was an inadvertent omission. Central High School was a wonderful, in many ways, experience for me because for the first time in my life I had Jewish girlfriends and Jewish boyfriends pretty soon too. We did what every kid did. We sneaked out whenever we could and went across the street to the J. I don't remember exactly why and what we did, but we spent a lot of time at the J. School was fine. School was good. It was a tough time because it was just we were very shortly into the war, and there was a serious note about school. And all of a sudden there were first aid classes. Nobody had first aid classes in high school up until that time that I knew of. But it was okay. I had a good time. I belonged to a few clubs, not a whole lot. Made every math teacher I ever had contact with miserable, I know. But it was fair because they made me miserable too. But school was good. School was okay. There were happy days, and there were good. There was a lot of good social interaction. I don't think too much.
Who were your friends?
Who were my friends? Well, let me see. There was F.B. Ethelyn Lashinsky. She's Ethelyn Roseman now. There was Beverly Miriam, who is Beverly Krasny now. There was Sarah Cadis, who became Sarah Waskoff. May she rest in peace. Who else? There was Harriet Gateman. I can't remember her married name. Harriet left Omaha and has been in California for many years. Some of those girls. There was Jeanette Turitz, who's my dear Jeanette, who lives right next door to me, Jeanette Napomnick. And it's lovely to be able to say we've known each other for 60 years. They were good friends, lots of good friends. I've been very fortunate to have many good friends. And a good roommate too.
So you met your roommate in college?
Well, actually, I knew him before that because our brothers were good buddies, our older brothers. And we really knew each other, but we got a little more closely acquainted. I guess he was already in the service, but he was close. He was in the service, but he was at home, so to speak, so he wasn't far away, and I wasn't all that far away, and somehow or another, I can't remember how or why, but we started dating in, I guess, 1942, and in spring of 43, we were married, and Leonard was in the service. We had a short time left in the service after our marriage. He was honorably discharged the following August, and we left. We'd been at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. We left there and came back to Omaha. Leonard had always known he would go back to school because his education was interrupted with service at that time, like that of his contemporaries. Somehow, I don't know why or who put the idea in whose head, but law school was the place that he decided he wanted to go. And I don't remember whether we just thought it'd be a lark to shoot for the moon. I mean, why go to Nebraska if maybe you could get into the University of Chicago? And he did, without a whole lot of trouble. There were all sorts of special programs available to service people, and I'm sure that he would have gotten in anyway on the strength of intellect, background. But in any event, we did, in our early 3.5 years of marriage, we were in Chicago. I used to tease and say I belonged to that first group who worked to put their husbands through college. And actually, most of us wives didn't do the whole job of putting our husbands through college. The government helped, and we were in Chicago while he earned a law degree for 3.5 years, 3.25 years, whatever it was. We like to say that our eldest was at his graduation in utero, but in any event. I think Leonard told the story from there. We took Steve, our eldest, and went to Washington State where we were going to settle because it was a wonderful part of the country and it just seemed like a great idea. And it is a beautiful part of the country, and we did have a couple of nice years there. We made deep, lasting friendships with lovely people there, but we only stayed 2 years and came back to Omaha and began raising our own family.
At what point did you become involved in the Jewish community as your mother had been?
Well, like my mother before me, not while my kids were little and at home and in school. They were pretty much out of school. When my children were small enough to be at home, I did a little volunteer work. I belonged to the usual women's organizations and did a little volunteer work, but not much of anything. I cannot remember exactly. I'm guessing that when our fourth child, Lisa, went away to school, I suddenly was surrounded with a lot of empty space and empty time. And I was in a group, or at a meeting, or I don't remember. There were a number of us, and Mary Fellman was present. And she and I were visiting, and she asked me something about what I was up to these days, and I said, not much of anything. I don't really have enough to do. And Mary Fellman, being Mary Fellman, registered that in her mental computer, and in no time she made a suggestion or two. And I think I really got started by going out to the Jewish Community Center and saying, what do you need? What can I do? And I began working a couple of days a week, I think, with Dory Gerber, who was at that time the executive secretary to the executive director of the Jewish Community Center. And because I still remembered some of my early skills, my shorthand, and I've always never stopped typing ever from the age of 14, I think. I began working with Dory. We used to laugh. We were taught shorthand by the same teacher in Central, and as a result, I could read Dory's notes, her shorthand notes. But anyway, that was where some of that began, and somehow I worked my way from Dory's office into the Jewish Press office. And I'm not certain how that was accomplished either. It's been too long, I don't recall. But I started volunteering in the office and doing little bits and pieces, and Suzanne Singer was still working in the office at that time. Morris Moline was editor. Judy Marburg was assistant editor, I think was her title. And we were a small group, and we had a wonderful time. It was the greatest place in the world to be. And I really don't recall what led to the first thing I wrote. But for some reason or another, Morris was quite taken with it and printed it. And I don't know, somebody said, we used to do a column, Mary probably, again. I think Mary reminded the office crew that years before, there had been a column in the Jewish Press on a weekly basis, a nostalgia thing. What happened in 1935? What happened in 1927? Whatever. In any event, I said, well, I could do that. I could do a column like that. And I began by picking a year. All of the old Jewish Press issues are bound in books and by year, and I began by selecting a year arbitrarily, not for any particular reason, and I would sit in the office and just flip through the pages and take notes, pull out things that I thought might be of interest, try to mention names of people who were present, who were at that time in the community or known in the community. Of course, everybody likes to see their name in the paper. So it was a column that people began to look forward to and were very kind and complimentary about. Somehow it was a fun column. Everyone liked it. I did it for years and years and years until I was so bored with it, I could hardly stand it anymore, and until I realized I had gone through, I think, every year that the press had been published. I didn't do it in consecutive order, but by the time I finished, just about every year had been recognized. And somehow, I don't know how or where Bert's Eye View was born or where the idea came from. I really don't remember. Morris probably. Morris was, if I had a mentor in the press or in that office, it was Morris Moline, my dear good buddy. Morris was helpful, he was supportive, he was sweet, and even though he was the only male in our group, he was the victim of a gynocracy, I think we used to say, and he loved it. Morris was just always a dear friend to me, and anything I ever did in that office, anything I ever did in print.
And then you got involved in the share home, right?
Yes, that was that was my mother's doing, which I, of course, didn't know until after the fact. My mother decided at one point that I'd had enough freedom and enough of not giving anything back, so to speak. And I think the fact that she always felt that she got so much more back than she gave in any of that kind of volunteer work. I think she wanted me to have some of the same pleasure, and I think she felt that I would be able to handle it, and she thought that I might become interested, and she was right. She finagled. My mother was a great finagler, and manipulated things until she saw to it that I was invited to sit on the board of directors of it was still the old share home. It was coming around the last years of the old share home, but I think 2 or 3 years before we built the new home, I sat on that board. We went through several administrators at that time. People went in and out. And there were great changes, very great changes that were made between the old share home and what became the Rose Blumpkin home. And I was involved, and my mother was right. I was very interested and spent, it seemed like 100 years on that board, and enjoyed the work of the board, enjoyed the connection, and began to understand and appreciate what my mother had felt all those years.
You served in many capacities on that board. Would you like to tell us about those?
Well, I must have been the secretary forever. I was the president for 2 terms. I did something I was on, all the usual committees. I did a lot of the PR, a lot of the publicity for many years. And in fact, Sylvia Rothman and I together did, some years ago, one of the greatest projects that I can remember doing. She's done many, but together we did a special Jewish press issue whose focus was the Rose Blumpkin Jewish Home, and gee, that was just a lot of fun. that was a very gratifying experience. And we just don't get too many of those kind of gratifying experiences, but whatever. My roommate told you about my children.
Well, sometimes you spend time in Omaha, and I know you have another home.
We have, in the last year, made some changes in our lives, and yes, the last few winters we've been spending time running away from winter and spending time in Arizona, which is always nice. We have very dear friends there, and we have very dear family there. And it's also closer to California, where we also have very dear family. Last winter, before we left, we did acquire a second home, and it'll be a winter home for a while. We don't know. Who knows what's down the road, but we're looking forward to winters there. And closer to our friends. My brother and his family are in that area, and it's always a special time for us to be able to spend together those winter months when we're there. So that's a different aspect of our lives, my roommate and I.
You said that your parents left quite a legacy for you. What kind of legacy would you like to leave for your children?
What kind of legacy? Well, I think it's very different because I am here in the same city that my parents were in, and where my parents were both known for their deeds and their work. My children are scattered. I guess I'd like my children to know that their mom was a good citizen, was a good citizen of the Jewish community, as well as the community at large. I don't know. I guess I just like them to remember that Mom wasn't such a bad sort when you got right down to it. She was crabby and very tough when they were kids, but I don't know what any of us want. We want our kids to think kindly of us and to remember we were good folks. We did right by them. We tried our best for them, no matter how hard they made it. My kids are very busy, very successful, overachievers. I think we're probably responsible for, but they are fine members of their own communities, and Leonard and I are very proud of them. This is a picture of my mother and dad, probably one of the last good pictures that was taken of them. I think it's a lovely likeness of two dear people. This is a family picture. On the left, of course, is my dad. I'm standing next to him. My brother is next to me, and Mother is on the right. I think that I was about maybe 4, which would mean that my brother was 8. This picture was taken on the occasion of our 50th anniversary. Standing from the left, our eldest, Stephen. Next to Stephen is our youngest, Lisa. Next to Lisa is Joel and Leonard, of course. And seated next to me is Shelley. It was a wonderful occasion, and we were very pleased to have our children all with us. This is another picture taken on our 50th anniversary. Standing in the back from the left are Edith, who is Stephen's wife, Dennis Carden, who is Shelley's husband, Jennifer, who's Joel's wife, Joel, Serge Goldstein, who is Lisa's husband, and Stephen. And next to Stephen is Leonard. And seated from the left are Lisa, Shelley, and me. This photograph was taken on May 13th, 1945, the day Leonard and I were married. From the left, my brand new father-in-law, Saul Lewis. Next to him, Millie Lewis, and my groom and his bride, my mother and my dad. A nice day.
This on the left is my dad, of course, and on the right, my mother. It was taken some years before our marriage. I can't quite identify the year. Unfortunately, neither one of them was photogenic. They were quite handsome people.